So should we begin? Okay, if we can start, could everyone just kind of give your names, just introduce yourselves to the camera so that...
Rochelle Marrinan. I'm at Florida State University.
I'm Elizabeth Wing, and I'm retired.
I'm Elizabeth Reitz. I'm at the University of Georgia.
And I'm Irv Quitmyer, and I'm a research associate at the Florida Museum of Natural History, and I've recently retired from the Environmental Archaeology Laboratory.
Thank you. And if I could also ask, just so around what time were you at UF? And I know that the answer is going to vary across the table.
I think I'm the oldest student of Liz's here. Probably chronologically too. But anyway, I was here as an undergraduate until 1971. And in 1971, I took a field school with Charles Fairbanks on Kincaid Road, basically, out east of town. And for my field school paper, I needed a project. And so another graduate student, Stephen Kumba, who was in the lab working with Liz at the time, suggested I choose one of the features in the site that had a lot of faunal remains and work on that. So he had to take me to introduce me to Liz to get permission to kind of hang out in the lab. So that was my first experience. And then I left, and then Betsy came, basically.
Oh, yes. Although we overlapped.
Well, not really so much. I mean, I went to Tulane for a couple of years, and during that time, Betsy came and was thoroughly ensconced.
Yes, I came, it was probably 71. And does that sort of fit where you might think?
But you were doing a different thing.
Yes, I started off doing a completely different master's or a completely different project, and my roommate was studying with Liz, Cass Bird, and I took Cass to the Jacksonville airport, and we had a long wait. She was going off to her dissertation research in Ecuador, and I waxed poetic about how important the anthropological education was in applied anthropology, and she waxed poetic about how important zooarchaeology and environmental archaeology were, and we convinced one another. She convinced me to come talk to Liz about changing my major or my field of specialization. Cass plugged ahead with her zooarch, but then she became a state archaeologist in Louisiana.
So
Yeah.
didn't pursue zooarch so much.
Yeah.
And let's see, I came in 1979, and just prior to that, I thought I wanted to be a historic archaeologist, so I was working at a place in the lower northern peninsula of Michigan called Michilimackinac, and we had recovered some faunal remains, and when I got back to the lab, I went to Liz and said, I'm kind of interested in what this stuff is and would like to learn to identify it. And so she gave some space to me. And that turned out to be really interesting material. And then I guess it was roughly late 79, 80, Liz came and asked if I would like to work a large project at Kings Bay Naval Base, and it's there that we went and excavated numerous archaeological sites where I headed up the sampling and then later the identification of those materials, and then I didn't go away. I stayed. Thank you.
Can I ask each of you what attracted you to zooarchaeology? Like what really, or if not attracted, what really sunk its hooks into you, I guess, where it was like, okay, I'm sticking with this, I'm going to do this and not the millions of other things an anthropologist can end up doing or trying to do?
The bones, of course.
I good thing to start, I suppose. I didn't go to college right out of high school. I went to nursing school. And anatomy, human anatomy, really interested me a great deal. One of my first courses here at the University of Florida when I came back to school was a human anatomy course with Bill Maples. But zooarch is everything else. Humans are pretty easy because there are only, 206, 207 bones. But fish, fish are amazing. And when I started learning fish, I would literally go home at night and close my eyes and there would be fish parts, or I'd dream and there were fish parts in the dream. And that lasted for about a month and then I was fine. But it's making those kind of mental templates that when you start, they're so much fun. It's just fun. I mean, it's science, of course, but it's just fun because the bones, there are just so many different kinds of things, and just doing a basic species list to see what you have in any site is pretty interesting. So it's a puzzle, and it's a lot of fun.
Am I supposed to say something?
Yeah, why did you switch from...
From killing pocket gophers.
Right, yeah. I can understand why you get tired of killing pocket gophers.
It was over 300, wasn't it?
Oh, I've forgotten.
It was a lot.
No, it wasn't.
I think it was. It seems like I read your master's thesis and I was shocked at the killing power.
Liz, we skipped over you. You didn't tell us when you came here.
I came here after getting my BA up north,
Right.
and the question was, let me think, where can I go for further education to study whole animals, not just cells, not just the function of cells, but the whole animal, what they now call ecology. But in those days, that was hardly recognized term. And so there were two suggestions from people I valued their opinion. And one was Chicago, and one was the University of Florida. And immediately I thought, Chicago, that means city. Yikes, I'll go to the University of Florida site unseen. So here I came, and it was the best choice among many choices that I've made. I've really, really, really enjoyed working or studying at in the zoology department at the University of Florida, specifically the Florida Museum of Natural History, and it just went from there.
Well, I think it's important too that you really made something where there was nothing. I mean, you literally created a zooarch lab at first, and I have to say that when I first came into the lab, I was very impressed by the baby food jars and the cheese whiz jars, particularly, and things of this sort that you managed to collect, to keep specimens in, because it
came at a crucial point in my life.
The baby food, yes, but where did the cheese whiz
Yeah,
fit?
we have the cheese whiz story.
Late night writing.
I don't think so, because, nachos weren't a thing then. They just weren't
No,
a
but
thing.
you needed a bigger jar.
Some things, of course.
So you ate cheese whiz as a sacrifice to the lab?
I don't actually remember just consuming that in inordinate amounts. But the baby food jars, yes. Yeah, that.
Right.
Liz, a while back, I think that you and I and Kitty, we were talking about the effect of the Depression as a child. And the reason that I'm bringing that up, it has to do with baby food jars also.
Cheese whiz jars.
Yeah, the cheese whiz jars, which are storage containers, which are kind of outside the best practices of the museum. But we allow it.
And they work well.
And they work well, yeah. So, could you tell tell us about?
Well, I was born in 1932, and that was born to parents who had suffered through great deprivation of depression, first in Austria and then in this country. And how should I put it, the needing to save, not to throw away good stuff, just be frugal, was ingrained in all of us at that time. And so hence the using the baby food jars. We didn't have to buy, at that time anyway, museum boxes of specific sizes and conformation. So in every case, we tried to use things that we didn't have to buy. They were available, and we managed.
Taught self-sufficiency, didn't it?
Yeah, we managed.
I do blame you for my hesitation at dumpsters and things of that sort.
You never know what you'll find.
This is true, but it's really useful, right?
Yeah. And I came to the museum where there was no, there was little space to begin with, and there was no zooarchaeology, so I majored in study of mammals. There was room for that, and I just enlarged it a little bit to include study of the animal bones from archaeological sites. And this followed a pattern that I learned early on when I was in high school and college. During the summers, I worked at the Harvard Museum of Natural History, Museum of Comparative Zoology, and I worked. I was just a volunteer. I was just, on a very. I did what I was asked to do. And one of the curators at the MCZ had worked on animal remains from major sites in the Near East. And she was working just on the mammals from that site. And so I saw that whole procedure while I was numbering bones and doing things of that sort that one needs to do in museum collections. And so when I then came to the University of Florida, one of the first sort of assistant jobs that I had was working in the basement of the Siegel building with someone who was working on archaeological materials. And I was to help him work on those materials. And that was an experience in many, many ways, because I don't know if you know the Siegel building, it has a ramp that goes down into the basement, and that's, if it rains, it's a sluice for water, and so they had concrete blocks arranged so that you could get into the collection with dry feet, or more or less dry feet. Across the way, there happened to be a colony of gopher tortoises that Walter Offenberg was studying, but I was working in the anthropology laboratory there, and they had bags and bags of the discarded animal remains from those features where they were studying the pottery and flint and so on. I thought, that should be, just for completeness, that should be added on. And so one thing followed another.
Do you have comparative collections there at that time, Liz, in Siegel Building?
Oh, there was in the mammal department, and I only started with mammals and then went to herps, and it was up to me to make the fish skeletons.
The lower vertebrates.
Lowest of the low.
I have a question about comparative collections. You started the comparative collection at the Florida Museum of Natural History, and you have in your institutions also worked with comparative collections. How was developing those comparative collections? If you could share some of your experiences on teaching collections.
Sure.
It's the dark side. It's the dark side of Zoarc.
Well, no, the vital side, actually.
Well, it's true.
True.
It's true. But getting there is the dark side.
Well, you can only rely on manual, illustrations in manuals so far. I mean, they'll maybe diagram a cat skeleton, but how does that help you in identifying a mouse skeleton? You can identify the femur or the humerus. They look similar, but in detail. And some of these details are very, very subtle. And so we would start, because they had it in the comparative anatomy classes, they'd have a goat or a dog or something mounted. Well, that might be a start, but then you have to get more detail from there to identify the remains from a mixed faunal assemblage. And I think this reference to the dark side is that in order to get those skeletons, you might have to pick up roadkills and prepare them, identify them first, because you have the whole animal and you can identify it accurately, and then prepare a skeleton from there. Have you ever done that?
I have.
So you know how to.
No wonder.
My master's advisor is a zooarchaeologist.
Yeah.
In fact, the book that you both Reitz and Wing, it's an important manual in the lab. So,
Oh, yeah, good.
Oh, yeah. Where did you study?
at Binghamton, it's Peter Stahl.
Oh, very much.
Yes.
Where?
Peter Stahl.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah,
right.
yeah.
I'd like to add about the use of collections and the sorts of things that all of these folks teach their students. And I'll give an example here. If you take a fish skeleton, just the skull itself will have several hundred bones, and then you have the postcranial part of it. And so that's a known specimen. You've seen it in the flesh. You take it and identify it and render it to bones. But can you imagine taking that whole skeleton and putting it in a bag and taking the hammer and breaking it up? And that's what the archaeological materials do. So if you'll give a thought here, most of our students have command over around 150 to 200 taxa. And so, and most of those in our case are fish. So let's say 200, and you multiply that times 200 or 300 elements in a skeleton, and that tells you what they have command over. But then you take and break it up, and they can actually identify each one of those little fragments. And so you've been there and know that. But that's the sort of thing that is taught and we get from the comparative collections.
So you worked in the Florida Museum of Natural History and had very limited space to start the environmental archaeology program. How was your relationship with the other departments within the museum, particularly when we're talking about mammalogy or vertebrate paleontology? If you had any sort of collaboration going on?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Well, and having done graduate work in the mammal collection, in mammalogy, and then snooping around in the bird collection and the reptiles, getting to know the curator and explaining the reason for wanting to borrow a specimen in order to study it, and all of those things becomes a fairly collaborative effort.
I think when I was there, it was a zooarchaeology lab, and it was in natural science. So we were in the middle floor of the museum, and I think it was an incredibly rich place to start a career in zooarchaeology, because you had all the curators of the collections right next to you. I mean, all of us took anthropology courses, but it was these other courses and a lot of the just day-to-day conversations. The curators were also very nice. They would let us sit in their classes. I sat in mammals classes and herps classes and things of that sort, just not even as a registered student. I just sat in. We also had parties, a lot of parties together. Every Thursday we would take, this goes back to the dark side. Every Thursday we would take some things frozen out of the freezer because it was full of animals that needed to be macerated. And so we would defrost them Thursday night, and then Friday morning we would all come in. We had agreed to do this, all the people working in the lab, because we needed more specimens at that time in the early 70s and mid 70s, and then early 80s as well. So we would have these maceration events every week, and we got a lot of specimens, and including ones that we were bringing in ourselves from roadkills and things of that sort during that time. And then we had these parties, and everyone accused us of using roadkill in our parties, but we didn't. But then, of course, on top of the Bartram building, we had a macerating emporium, right? We had a place where we could basically macerate things, and I understand that came to no good in the long run, but while I was there, we were moving stuff through pretty rapidly, and it was really an incredible experience to see that happen and to get the things basically on the shelf and useful. So it is one of the things that some students can simply not tolerate. I've had kids just leave me with a freezer full of smelly dead things because they just couldn't handle it. So there is a part of what you have to do to get specimens that some students can manage and others simply can't. But we also collect. I mean, when we go anywhere, we collect. I mean, Betsy and I were in Haiti together, and we went to the various markets. We went to where fishermen came in and we would buy their catch. I learned this in Mexico from Liz, watching her go down to the beach every evening and buy the collateral catch of shark fishermen, and then come home and actually what she would do is fillet one side and salt the thing, and then it would be in the sun and dry. But I have to tell this story about being in Mexico and going through this process. Liz made all these collections during the 2 weeks we were there, and about a day or so before we left, it started to rain. So the most recent fish had not cured very well. But we packed them all up in boxes, and they became a part of our luggage. Well, I went to see, I left Liz and her 2 children and went to visit an anthropology graduate student who was in one of the communities near Guadalajara doing her ethnographic field work. And when I met them again in Mexico City, they were all sitting in the hotel where I thought we were staying. And little Stevie comes up to me and says, "We are not staying here. They said our luggage smelled." So we were in a hotel around the corner. But anyway, it was, these are just things that happen. When we came through customs in Tampa, we came through faster than anybody I'd ever seen. And I think it was, I really thought they'd look at every plastic bag. This is during high times for marijuana importation and things of this sort, but they put us right through. And off we went.
I sprayed mine with, it was from Trinidad, wasn't it?
I was sitting here thinking about that.
Exactly.
Betsy and I were in Trinidad together. Go ahead.
Oh, well, and knowing that y'all had a certain amount of difficulty and knowing that my specimens were not, didn't smell very nice, I got bug spray and I sprayed, I emptied the can into the container so that when somebody said, "It smells strange," I said, "Well, I didn't want to import any insects, and so I sprayed the contents." And that's what you're smelling is the bug spray.
We would often...
They bought it. I'm just amazed.
We would often go to the field with a garbage can. In other words, our luggage would be a garbage can. And then...
It's true.
I know.
So, you put all your stuff in a garbage can and you go to wherever it is, like Haiti for me. And then you've got the garbage can to bring the fish back, or whatever animals you have, back to the States. And you just put them all in there and tape the thing shut and air freight it.
If it sat on the tarmac in the sun
Well,
for
there was that. In
a while.
Mexico, yes, there was that.
Well, and that's what happened to the stuff I brought back from Peru. They called me up. They called me up from the airport here in Gainesville and said, "Your package has arrived." I drove out to the airport to pick up my package, which was a trash can, and it was at the end of the runway. I mean, it was so far away from the buildings that you just couldn't believe it.
Well, this sort of thing happens,
Yes.
but it need not be dreadful.
Oh, no.
But it takes some effort to make it less dreadful. And we all tried to put that effort in, but
Sometimes we don't, it doesn't succeed.
Yeah.
You don't want to end up with a reputation,
and the other way of preparing these skeletons would be to give them to have a beetle colony to consume but it has to be dry. That's the problem. It has to be dry, and that's often difficult. I mean, with certain specimens, it's difficult.
Especially in the tropics.
Yeah.
Beetles they're also they have taste.
Problems as well.
Yes.
Some things they like better than others.
Definitely.
But also if they get loose, then you've got a real problem, which is why we don't use beetles.
Yeah, they have to be done elsewhere.
Well, I use Beetles, and it does not help with the odor.
You use some what?
Beetles,
Oh, yeah.
yeah,
Oh, well, there is a little bit.
right.
Yeah.
We share our facility with our next door neighbors or the enterprise technology folks, and anytime there is any sort of odor that strikes them as just a little weird, they call up physical plant, and physical
Oh,
plant
dear.
comes, and
Oh, dear.
and it may not be me.
No, it probably wasn't.
It
just
probably
is-
wasn't.
They found someone to blame everything
That's
on.
right.
Yeah.
All odors that
Yeah.
are unsatisfactory emanate from my bug colony.
But it's my understanding that you've reported to me that you have had a special relationship with those bugs during the winter.
Oh, yes. Well, I don't know whether they were serving me or I'm serving them. But, as I prepare Thanksgiving dinner for them and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Yes.
So you turn the lamp on and.
Oh, yeah. They're very smart critters.
They know how to.
Well, the heat went off in the bug room once, and what I did was I had a little space heater, so I brought in an aquarium into my office with the space heater, and I would turn on the light, put my bag down, turn on the space heater, and the bugs got to the point where I'd turn on the light, put down my bag, turn around, and they were all lined up against the glass against the space heater.
Waiting for work.
Waiting for dinner, waiting for warmth. Yeah, it was just amazing.
Yeah, that's remarkable.
I learned a lot about beetles having them in my office, but I was glad to get them out.
Oh, yeah.
I have a question both for Liz and for Betsy. Do you think that zooarchaeology would have been invented in some other environment other than a museum? And the reason that I'm asking that is that it was impressive to me that when you were talking about interacting with the various ranges, being able to go and talk with someone in birds or in fishes, you think it would have been?
Well, when we work on the cross-section of vertebrate, the skeletons of the cross-section, all of the fish, et cetera, often the people that just work with the whole animal don't actually know the details of the skeleton. So we've had people, curators come, now what is the, some little bone. And then they get interested. Not enough to go into it in depth often, but all vertebrate biologists have to know something about the skeleton and the relationship between the skeletons of closely related animals. So yeah, I think.
Yeah, I think one of the really fascinating things about the Florida Museum, more so when we were up before they started building walls inside the museum, was the holistic aspect where the fisheries people and the mammal people and the paleo people all came to the Friday party.
Yeah.
And we went to their parties, and that kind of interaction is just
Priceless.
you can't do what we do without
the kids who are
that.
downstairs in answer because they don't get that kind of enrichment that we got.
Yeah.
And it was just critical.
Yeah.
It was good.
Yeah. I think that what you and that kind of activity only takes place in a museum, but it does take work even in a modern museum where they get so large. It's hard to get people to come together in some sort of meaningful way across those disciplinary boundaries. But those disciplinary boundaries are real impediments to anthropology.
Unless there's some feature of one of the departments that another department would like to get engaged in, so to speak. I'm trying to think of an example, but
Well, ecology
yeah,
and climate change.
right.
Geochemistry.
Geochemistry, particularly any of those studies, they're now finding that instead of us going to them asking for insights, they're coming to us because we're the ones that have the history and the time depth. They can look at modern specimens, but they can't establish a chronology, and we can.
Yeah.
So actually, I see us having been through a period where, people have. One of the things I tell my students is, at one point, the people who did the studies of animal bones from archaeological sites were biologists, and their students turned into anthropologists, and all of those people ended up ultimately in museums. I mean, there's a cycle that's been going on. And I think now Zooarch is actually more integrated. The environmental anthropology side of it is
More integrated into the anthropology than in zoology, which is
It's pretty vital, I think, in anthro now. Pretty critical.
Well, that's good though.
But going back to your question about it takes a museum, I think it had to start in museums, because you have to have the collections. And departments of anthropology don't have those kinds of collections. They may have collections of human remains or ceramics or lithics or things of that sort, but in general, they don't have comparative collections.
Right.
And it really takes a museum to manage that well. I mean, my department has a comparative collection, which is not really great because it isn't a museum collection. And
but it is a vital thing
to
have a comparative collection.
It is. And I just think, you look at, I guess, Theodore White and Parmalee and others, most people of Liz's vintage, basically, in starting zooarchaeology come from museums.
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
White was at Dinosaur, but that was kind of like a museum. He was in the
Sure.
museum
Right.
aspect.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah.
Anyway. So having I think the interesting thing is that the Zooarch lab became an environmental archaeology lab. And I think that there are some real interesting stories. I think the real transition occurs in the early 80s when other people become interested in slightly other things, like invertebrates, for example, meaning crabs and mollusks and things of that sort. Soils, Sylvia Scudder basically started looking at soils. So in essence, we were looking at a broader variety of things, and also publishing kind of manual to tell archaeologists who wanted to have work done by people in the lab what we needed from them to be able to do the work. I think that was really critical as well. So there were a lot of changes that occurred right in that period from about 1980 to 85 that I think were really pretty critical for the lab. And
this more holistic approach extends to the study of the skeletons, because it used to be just the skull. It just tossed the rest of those long bones away. We've got the skull. But
And I can't ID skulls. The fish people will bring this whole bone into me, the whole neurocranium, and say, "What is it?" And I say, "I haven't a clue. I never see that."
I find myself in fish markets lifting the lip of the fish. I don't know it. It's true.
Where was that we were at the ICAS? I think it was all.
It was Washington.
In Washington. Served up a poached salmon.
Yes.
Remember that big huge thing? And it was like flies on a carcass, Say, oh, look at this.
Folding that sucker up.
It's in the collection.
It is. Was that Washington? Oh my God.
Yeah, it was Washington.
It was. That was,
Yeah.
We scavenged the skeleton from the buffet table.
that was a good one. Very complete.
I think one of the things that I always like to say about this multidisciplinary stuff that we do, and you've been hearing about here, it's really the boundaries between those disciplines where these great discoveries are being made, and we're starting to see that come out of National Science Foundation and folks like that. And so I would point out here that it started very, very early at the Florida Museum, and in particular in the Zooarchaeology lab. When I arrived there, we were. I don't think we had very many, if any, mollusks in that
That's correct.
in that assemblage, and you pointed me to Doug Jones, who was working with looking at the growth increments in shells, and so here we pull a young man in from Princeton that had just gotten his degree and was studying growth increments, and we told him what we wanted to do. So Liz got that started. So it's also the networking where you bring those in. And by the way, Jones is now the director of the Florida Museum of Natural History.
Well planned.
Well planned. Good job.
Yeah, absolutely.
So-
Yeah. Well, and early on, if there was a question about a skeleton, well, if you don't have the skull, throw up your hands in despair.
Yeah.
I mean, and so the obvious step is, because it's a whole animal, it lives, every part functions. And so obviously the whole thing needs to be studied. And oh dear, did we say something
That's
bad?
okay, I need to check my phone. I'm a department chair and they know where I am.
Pardon me.
It's okay. I'll just check. No problem. May not be anything important, but you never know.
Actually, one of the things that I often refer to in
Tanya Paris says, have fun at the Zooarch lunch.
Hi, Tanya.
Another student, a third generation.
Third generation, yeah. One of the things that I tend to think of is that, and I actually think this is what attracted me to first anthropology and then to Zooarch and fairly quickly to the broader environmental archaeology, was that we're not really we don't really live along the boundaries. We live between these disciplines, in the spaces between them.
We do.
And that gives you all sorts of freedom and flexibility to pursue. You remember when Polly came out with the trophic level study?
Yeah.
How rapidly you and Steve dove into that?
Yeah.
And now it's a pretty basic, I mean, lots of people are doing that now. And we wouldn't have done that if we were hidebound by a discipline.
Right.
Allometric scaling too, to do estimates of what the bone actually means in terms of flesh that people eat. I think that was really a breakthrough. I think the seasonality studies on clams that came out of Kings Bay, I mean, all these kinds of things are really such contributions and different ways of thinking, the trophic level, different ways of thinking about how food is used and what people go after. I think all those things have been really great contributions.
Which kind of brings us to a question. The comparative collections, by and large, all 12,000 plus specimens that are in there right now and still growing, for the most part have weights and measures. And so, my question, Liz, when did we start taking weights and measures in those collections?
In the comparative collections,
I think it started with the macerating sessions.
Fairly
Is that right?
early on.
Because we did a lot of fish.
And that was.
Yeah, you were certainly doing it when I got there.
Then the crab.
The crab thing.
When you go to one of our parties, sometimes, depending on what what is going on in the lab, you may have to peel your stuff and let it be weighed before you can eat it. Because that's basically the way we got allometric scaling for blue crabs, stone crabs, things of that sort, which do show up in some sites in great quantities, actually, so they're important.
And always in little bits.
Yep.
Little bits.
Yeah.
Bits.
Yeah. So then in the 1980s, we started doing that for the most part.
So you speak about your relationships as being in between the disciplines within the museum, and Dr. Wing, you started with this sort of analysis and defining zooarchaeology here in the United States. How was the relationship with other archaeologists who were working with faunal assemblages in other parts of the world? How that correspondence has changed throughout time, and how it was with you and how it has been with you all. People will come from, let's say, from the Middle East and say, I have this epiphysis of this bone. What is this? Mm-hmm. So it has changed. How I want to say how zooarchaeology worked within anthropology at those earlier stages.
Well, I think this is a broad generalization that I probably shouldn't even articulate, but what I was going to say is that in the European collections, and I'm thinking primarily of the Netherlands and Germany, they paid more attention to the whole animal and rather than focusing on the skull as was done early on in this country, because many of the museum collections, say of mammals, would be skins and skulls, and the skeleton was too much trouble, I guess, or not viewed as that important. So I'm talking early on, it was skins and skulls, whereas I think, and I may be mistaken, at that time, in the Netherlands anyway, they paid more attention to the whole skeleton. I'm not sure that holds up, but that's sort of a general impression I have. But I think anybody working in Zooarch now would use the entire skeleton. I'm not sure that's the case in curators of mammal collections. I just don't know whether.
Yeah.
I
I think that actually every region seems to have its own research questions, and the collections that are used for those research questions tend to be appropriate for those questions. So the Europeans would look at whole animals of mammals because they were interested in the history of domestication of domestic animals.
Exactly. But throw away the fish.
Yeah, and the other is that they often looked at, because they're training, the difference between the American style of anthropology, which includes the four subfields, has social anthropology and archaeology and linguistics and physical anthropology all combined. In Europe, anthropology was a social discipline, and archaeology was a separate discipline, so that you actually had an institutional barrier to studying animal bones from archaeological sites for purposes of studying social history or anthropological questions. And so many of the researchers in Europe who were working in Asia and Europe and Africa didn't actually have a question about human behavior. They had a question about history, archaeological history. So their collections reflect that, and the way they used them reflect that. And over here we were almost immediately part of there was a strong biological component, but almost immediately in departments of anthropology, so that the questions were slightly different. The problem with saying there's a sharp line, however, is that, of course, there's a fair number of people here who are based in the United States who work abroad, and there are also plenty of people from abroad who work in the Americas. So while you can, for purposes of writing a chapter on the history of zooarchaeology, you can put them in two separate containers, but they're really not.
Yeah.
Because the people cross those boundaries.
Right.
But I think the questions change depending on where you are.
Where you were working.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think also having appropriate collections for the area you're working can be a real difficulty. I think, for example, the Florida Museum does a good job with southeastern U.S. and the Caribbean, and I know we have a lot of South American material from work that's been done and material that's been worked on in the past. But to do Near Eastern stuff, you'd really have to go somewhere else
That's right.
or borrow heavily from another museum, which is sometimes very difficult to do. But I think, having the appropriate collection for the material you're working on can be very difficult. And just finding the right place to do the analysis can be difficult as well, and financially difficult.
And building up a collection has all manner of legal constraints that very early on we didn't face to the degree they do now. Yes, and importing collections is.
Yeah, CITES and stuff like that.
Yeah, we tried to get a fossil whale bit up to Canada to be identified. Man alive. It was a fossil whale. It was not a live whale. It was a fossil.
376.
Yeah. And it got covered by CITES because it's an endangered and, in point of fact, extinct species. quite problematic.
Save that one.
Oh gosh, yes! Heaven forbid that we. We actually it ended up being hand carried to Steve Kumba.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah. Actually, one of your questions was about the role of Liz in the sort of global setting, and I would have to say that one of the most important roles, I don't know whether you think it's this, is the visitorship.
Yeah.
The number of people who come to this collection from all over the world to use it is I think, quite remarkable and integral.
Well, and this probably stems from the fact that you can't just go out and get a skeleton of X, Y, or Z. There are more and more limits to developing a collection.
We should have gotten X, Y, and Z before CITES.
Yeah.
Why is the last passenger pigeon someplace else and not in a Zooart collection?
The passenger pigeons, there were a lot of them that were done by Ward Scientific as skeletons for university labs and things of that sort. So that's pretty interesting.
Do you think some of those old pigeon skeletons may be passenger pigeons?
Yeah, exactly. You should check.
I will.
Seriously.
I've got a headless something or other, and
Right. You've got, just having
it's of the vintage.
Yeah.
Ooh.
Liz, last year for the Environmental Archaeology Laboratory, talking about visitors, we had 24 foreign visitors that came, representing over 1,600 hours of research
good for them.
done in the laboratory.
Yeah.
So that's a pretty good legacy, isn't it? Yeah.
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 Well, after the ICAS meeting in Washington, I think a fair number of those people packed up their bags and came to Gainesville.
Yeah, well, we had the fish.
Yeah, exactly.
Whose bags did that go back in? I think that was you, Rochelle. You brought that bag home.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you, Rochelle.
That was funny. That was a funny trip.
Well, so if I can ask, I mean, since you've kind of seen the field of Zooarch develop, I mean, really come from a time when it was expected that you would just ship the bones off to someone else to let's actually really ask anthropological questions about this. Early on, was it difficult? I mean, you've described a sense of community in the lab, in the museum. What about at national conferences or with other archaeologists and things like that? Like, did you have to kind of build that sense of community? Were there people outside of the lab who were really interested in these questions, or was that kind of a process of getting people to listen?
Well, I think as the field of archaeology developed, that seemed like the logical direction to take, and not just rely on a few tentative identifications for the skeletal material, but actually look at the whole, whatever was excavated. And excavations also changed. The change that I experienced, and you all would know better, but my impression was that it used to be, well, oh, here's something that I recognize, we'll save it. And then it changed to all of the skeletal material, the bag of bones, everything that was associated with that stratum or that pit or whatever. And so it became a more inclusive recording of what was there.
I think in the late 60s and early 70s, the emergence of the so-called new archaeology and the push for better standards in the field of screening,
That's really important.
just greater control, produced samples that could be informative. And I think once archaeologists found out what other kind of information they could get from fauna and also from flora, because they're paralleling at this time, they were very interested, and that interest has stayed. And I think I'm working on a paper with a student, a former student, the one who just, and one of the things that we say in this paper is that we totally reject the word ecofact. This is something that Binford basically started in the 60s. He's apparently the first one to use this term. And it was so dismissive of the kinds of information you can get from animal bones, from soils, from floral materials and things of that sort, that it was used during a time that privileged pottery and lithics and maybe human remains and maybe architecture. But those were the things that were really archaeology. Now we can really see that we can get at the kind of underbelly of what people are doing in the landscape. As one of my friends says, all archaeology is about food, fundamentally. Even these big Clovis points, it's about food. They're not killing each other, they're hunting megafauna. It's about food. And so, one of the things I would like to really see is the loss of this word in textbooks for both plant and animal remains. I just think it's dismissive and not germane anymore.
I think also there's a social component to what I've learned from you, Liz, and that's to be collegial, but not only that, but to be friendly and to listen and to discuss different viewpoints and that sort of thing. And I think that that's, again, one of the things that was imparted, I think, in the lab is to do that.
Very important, because we as zooarchaeologists have things to offer, but our colleagues who have excavated those things obviously have lots to offer us. So you have to speak together and understand each other. And then Rochelle mentioned the fine screening. I was on a rampage about getting people to do fine screening. That means a window screen size sieving, because that's where you would get many of the fish bones and the shrimp mandibles and things of that sort that were totally missed through the 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch gauge screens. And until you see a value in those, that sort of information, it's a lot of work to do fine screening.
It's a real commitment to time in the field.
Yeah.
I mean, for any archaeologist figuring a budget, it really is time consuming.
Yeah, a lot of work, and it has to be worthwhile, and I think we as zooarchaeologists can make it worthwhile by providing the type of information that otherwise would have been lost. There's no retrieving it.
I think one of the things that occurs to me as I'm listening to this, with the exception of Rochelle, we don't go out into the field and dig things up. So in terms of our relationships with our colleagues, we have to offer them something. They have to come to us and ask. Over the years that I've been at Georgia, I've probably worked with about 350 different archaeologists. And in each case, they have questions that there's a reason for their asking me to work with them. And sometimes those reasons need a little tweaking. And often they're offering me collections that have research potentials that they're not thinking about. I'm here working on a collection that was excavated in '94, and I'm doing a restudy because the questions have changed. We had this interest, we worked on the collection, and now, and I thought I was done in 2004, and it turns out that I'm not done. So it's this conversation that goes on. And of course, of the vast numbers of archaeologists, they still do potsherds and lithics, benighted souls that they are. But, the rest of us, we work with that group of people who are interested in the environmental, and that interface between archaeology, human behavior, the environment. And certainly, what happened to me, the reason I'm doing this restudy is that the questions have changed, the methods in terms of stable isotopes and analytical procedures have changed, and we can come back to these collections, which is another plug for museums.
They're doing stable isotope and so much more now.
Yes.
Studies that,
Yeah. Betsy, at the SAA that we came from, I was impressed with your comments, and it's relative to this discussion, that we really, as a discipline, we're more than a service group where we just identify bones. They don't come to us just to identify the materials. They know that we have opinions about it, and that we have experience with it, and so again, something that I've learned from, in fact, all of you, is that we just don't give them a fauna list. We write these things up. It's one of our requirements that we sit and the zooarchaeologist puts pen to paper. And I think that's a critical element of what we do.
One of the things I tell my students is sometimes the collection speaks to you.
Tells you something to do.
Tells you what you should be looking
I
at.
had to take some therapy for that.
If you hear voices in the middle of the night, that's probably not,
You know, one of the ways that if you're working in the lab with new students that are just beginning to become zooarchaeologists, one of the ways you know they're starting to get it is they actually dream about it. And
Yeah. I find deep bones in my sleep.
Look at Rochelle.
Well, the truth is, I cannot say that I'm a zooarchaeologist. I can say that I can do zooarch, and I can teach beginning students and get them started, and send them on their way to somebody else who's got better collections and better opportunities to work, like Betsy, like Liz used to be, and things of that sort. So I've really done more field archaeology in my time working on Spanish missions and in dreadful circumstances for the preservation of faunal remains. One good feature in 20 years of working on missions. So it's just the way the soils are in the Red Hills, just very tannic, so we don't get good preservation. But I think for me, the time I spent in the lab, especially the time I spent as a doctoral student, then as a postdoc with Liz in the lab, where there were grad students, where there were undergrads, it was very interesting because we often worked on each other's materials. We often worked in the field together, and it just was a very growthful place to be. And another thing too, while anthropology is supposed to be holistic and interdisciplinary, the zooarch range really was. And I think that was an important experience for many of the students who took the class just for interest.
Yes, I don't think you can ever forget that you're working with a relic of human behavior.
Right.
And that this is a biological relic of that human behavior. And whereas I think ceramics can get reified into something yes, right. Whereas I don't think you can do that. I mean, I think you always have to remember this is an anthropological result of anthropological behavior. One of the things about the lab that I think is that we tend to forget, although I remind my students of this, is that, when I first started off, I didn't know how to spell Odocoleus virginianus. I spent 200 times writing it, trying to remember how to spell it, and plagued Rochelle and Cass for help. And then in turn, I got plagued after they left, but that students teaching one another is a dynamic that I think the lab is absolutely crucial. And you serve your time as the plaguer, and then your obligation is to be...
Liz definitely got plagued by me. Definitely.
And I see that in my lab where, the senior students are plagued by the junior students. And once I had one come and complain to me, and I said, no, it's your turn.
It's really true.
Yeah.
So if you have a question of how do you teach interdisciplinary work, plague them.
Plague them, yeah.
Very stimulating, though.
Yeah, it is, isn't it?
It's really stimulating because everybody working on different collection with different information to be gained and different settings, and you have to really think.
Yeah, I'm seeing that's going on in the lab right now with the people working on the South Florida project. There's a young individual in there, and the way they come in, they help her, and that's a tradition that's just terribly important. And I suspect that in many more hierarchical labs, that wouldn't happen.
Also, helping each other can confirm what you believe or make you question what you thought you believed.
Yeah.
And all of that is really pretty healthy.
Yeah.
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 Another thing too is that we worked on different kinds of collections. So someone might be working on a historic collection with a lot of domesticates in it. My collection might be prehistoric with no domesticates whatsoever. And being able to see what was going on in a different site in the lab was really very helpful too. It kind of prepared you for the time when you would do a similar project. So, and it was just a great place to be. There are times in your life, I think, when you are in a situation where learning just occurs, and it's so intense, and you don't have periods like that often, but when they happen, they really change your life.
Yeah. Yeah.
The right group of people, the right circumstances, the right kinds of collections, right opportunities, it's just an amazing thing. And that's what the lab was for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Me too.
Yeah.
I've never regretted, I don't know why Cass went off and been a state archaeologist, but I'm delighted she talked me into coming to see you.
As am I.
That's very nice, but I've never ever thought that was a poor choice. I mean, it's just, I was ready to leave archaeology. I just was not interested in what they were doing.
Well, Liz, one time I was thinking about leaving, and I talked to you about that, and you turned to me and you told me, well, Irv, none of this is wasted time, and that has always stuck with me. Yeah.
That's the truth about anthropology, actually. Nothing is really wasted.
Yeah.
Even like having a nursing background and things like that was been very helpful. I've known all the diseases I could get in the field.
That's right. Exactly.
Yeah, but it turned you into to a really fine scientist, though.
Anyway,
Yeah.
we're the fun thing about it all is that we are all learning still.
Yes.
That's the fun.
Yeah.
If I can ask one more question about the, well, you've described the atmosphere in the lab, but Dr. Marrinan, you also wrote that the wing farm was kind of an oasis for students as
yes.
well. So I was wondering if you might have some things to say about that.
Now, there have been two wing farms.
Okay.
In essence, one was on Bivens Arm, we would have to say, even though it wasn't as palatial in terms of the spread as the one near Alachua. But just to be asked for dinner and things of that sort was a lot of fun because they had amazing animals. I mean, the peafowl were really neat, peacocks and peahens, and the pugs. These were the first pugs I ever saw. Dogs and goats. What?
Could you share the guinea pigs? Do you remember that? You blew.
Actually, I remember that. Was it a turkey that a male that was not socially kept attacking you, and so you just turned around and it's in the collection now.
And then there was Ginger the goat. Who found her way to the table.
What was that goat's name? Calico.
There's been so many, I forgot.
Calico was the one that got hooked by Baby Doc, the water buffalo.
Yeah, well, that was at the Alachua farm. Baby Doc was a water buffalo.
But I was thinking about the guinea pigs that Liz was keeping, and Liz sent the kids off someplace and had Peruvian friends to come.
I don't know this story.
No, you're the one that blew the cover because the kids were standing there and said, "Oh, well, Liz told us that the guinea pigs had gone off to the pet store." Okay. Well, I hadn't intended to tell that.
Actually, I knew Liz long before I ever met you. When you were on Bivens Arm,
Yeah.
and the place, our friends, the Kresdorns, were on the other side of Bivens Arm, and I kept hearing these. My entire childhood, I would hear these raucous screams, and never had a clue what they were. And years later, when I went to the farm, there they were making this raucous scream, and I finally solved the mystery.
Yeah, they were great.
The sound just carried across the water, and
Then at the Alachua one, there were those funky chickens,
yes.
those little bantams. You could never sleep late at the farm. Those chickens.
Well, it was dawn someplace.
Yeah.
Well, Rochelle, when Janice and I moved into our present-day house, I told Liz that I wanted to have chickens. And she goes, well, I'll give you some chickens, but you've got to take a rooster. And that was the deal, that I had to hold one of the roosters on.
That's true.
And it was one of those little bantams.
Well, getting up at 4 is good for the soul.
Not really.
It is.
I did it this morning. A good preparation. But it was also true that in going to the farm, we were kind of a part of the family, although, the kind of odd sisters or brothers or something of this sort for the children and for Jim. And Jim was a potter, and so what he did was very interesting too. And that was really a lot of fun for us, and so very different than living in a dorm or an apartment or whatever we were doing. It was just nice to be there.
That was pretty.
I won't go there.
Oh, we had a lot of fun. We had a lot of fun.
Yes, we have had.
And actually for the children, and I'm talking about my children, not these children, learning about animals and taking care of them and what's needed and how to keep them safe and all of those things, I think were important for their upbringing and living in the woods, so to speak. And Steve, both the children, I have a daughter and a son, both of them call themselves swamp children because for a while on the Bivens Arm, when we lived at Bivens Arms, there was sort of a woods, but it often flooded or was wet. So that was the swamp children place to explore. And as I think about it in my old age, we didn't really perhaps hover enough over them to keep them safe, but they seem to have figured out, you don't pick up a rattlesnake without thought. They seem to have stayed safe. Thank goodness.
Well, I think if you hover over them, they don't learn these lessons. And if you,
Well, the winged children were pretty interesting anyway.
Yeah.
And one Christmas, Stevie gave Liz for Christmas 2 dead birds. Remember?
I don't
One was
remember.
Elise bittern.
ooh,
Things that we didn't have in the collection. I mean, they were great. And I can't remember what the other one was, but it was something equally, probably a rail, actually.
Oh,
And, I thought, what kind of kid is this? He gives his mom 2 dead birds for Christmas. But when we were in Mexico, one evening we went down to the beach to buy the collateral catch. And that day they had caught a tiger shark. And Stevie was 7 years old at the time. And he was, his eyes just got so big. And he had to have the jaw. He just had to have the jaw. But Stevie stood in the carcass of that tiger shark and tossed out 27 fetal sharks. I mean, they had not been born. They were not, they're live bearers, and so these had not been born before the mother died. And and he walked off down the beach with his hand in his mom's, and he said to her, "This has been the happiest day of my life." That is no exaggeration. So.
Yeah, they had a lot of experiences.
They did.
Birthing, all those.
Yeah, all those baby sharks.
Yeah.
Well, now he's a marine biologist.
Exactly.
That's
I was also very impressed that Stevie understood the difference between Pacific fish and Atlantic fish, and that they were different, and
Yeah.
so many different species. When we were on the west coast in Mexico, we were seeing Pacific fish for the first time, which was fun for me, and he already knew this. So it was fun. It's fun. Stevie was fun.
yeah, he was.
Well, actually, when we got on the plane and Molly took your hand, he had to take mine. So that was a pretty amazing trip. Coming back, our plane blew a compressor on takeoff in Mexico City, so we sat on the ground for a long time, and our luggage got smellier and smellier, and they took everything off the plane and put it out in the hot sun on the tarmac, and it got even worse. It was. I was, I think, in my late 20s at that point, and going back, remember I was offered a coloring book by the stewardess, and we just thought that was remarkably
That's right.
Anyway,
Well, we had a lot of fun.
we have
Yeah,
had a lot of fun. Still to have more fun.
yeah, that was good. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think you've covered a lot of territory here.
I think so too.
Do you have any final thoughts you would want to share, or?
I guess, just from my perspective, that rearing children in the woods, so to speak, I mean, we had table manners too, you know. They had to have a range of behaviors that were acceptable. And in fact, our daughter went and lived with my mother for a year in Vienna, and so she learned a lot from that experience. Well, learning to speak German, for one thing, was a good thing. Went to school in the same school my mother had gone to, and Steve didn't have that kind of an experience, but he had a lot of natural history experiences that I think both of those served the children well in their adulthood and passing it on. So, yeah, it's not possible for everybody to rear their children in quite such a bizarre fashion, but, well, I mean, different fashion, yeah.
Well, Steve became quite a groupie for the Zoar kids too. I mean, we used to take him to the Rathskeller. He was, unfortunately, still in high school, but he seemed to fit in pretty well. We did have to drive him home sometimes because he was not safe on his bicycle.
Oh dear, yeah. Anyway, those were fun times.
Yeah.
Well, and I think in terms of Zooarch and environmental archaeology, it was just a remarkable ability to start something that is really so integrated.
Yeah, that's the important thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
Played out in the children and in us.
Your professional children.
Your professional children, right?
What should I say? An example of that is the mammologist who used to only work on the skull instead of the whole animal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's,
Yeah.
metaphors.
Well, and you have intellectual great-grandchildren now. Speaking of Peter Stahl, one of his students was Barnett Paval-Zuckerman, and Barnett, yes,
right.
and Barnett then came to me, and she is now a professor at University of Maryland with her own students.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
That's fun. Yeah.
And Betsy, you told me that you had one of your students that is now in retirement? Or
I know, I'm not going there.
It's amazing to me.
Yeah.
It is. I mean,
Yeah.
these people stop so early.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, Rochelle, when my retirement party came up,
You didn't even tell me. I asked you if you were having a retirement party.
I didn't know. I
And
didn't.
I would have come.
Oh, I know you
Yeah.
would. Yeah, I didn't know. They were afraid that I would refuse, but
They thought you would leave the building.
yeah, that was right. They were afraid I was going to leave the building. But one of the things that I noticed is that most of those people in the room, I'd seen most of them hired.
Yeah.
I'd seen their children come along, and you know.
Well, we hired one of ours who had
Yeah.
come here. Tanya Perez, basically.
Oh yeah.
Right.
Who was
Right.
here
Sure,
in Florida.
Yeah.
Working lab. So
Yeah.
we have a third generation.
But it's great to see that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
And
it's great to see
really
that.
interested. And what's so interesting to me is all the things that she's into that we wouldn't even conceived of when we first started. It's so, I mean, the field has really just gone in a lot of different ways. All of them, you know, pretty coherent, but there are many different things now that can be done that we really,
Lots of real creative people.
Yeah, that's right.
It is.
she's been working on turkeys lately. And I have this wonderful turkey gorget that I bought at one of the Southeastern companies. I'm waiting for that paper to be finished and then I'll give it to her. I've been looking for a home for that for years.
Wow.
Well, I know there's a lunch that people have to get to, so, yeah, this has been great. Thank you very much for all coming together.
Fun for us
Yeah.
to tell stories on ourselves.
Just to be together. Yeah. Yeah.